Good afternoon. My name is Sydney Rucker, and I serve as the Director of Diversity Initiatives for the Indiana University School of Medicine. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the 6th Annual Patricia Treadwell Women in Medicine Lecture. This lecture series honors the work, life, and professional legacy of Dr. Patricia Treadwell here at the IU School of Medicine. To ensure an optimal viewing experience for today's session, please click the view button in the top right corner of your screen. From there, select the side-by-side speaker view, and this will ensure that you're able to see today's presentation as well as a great view of our honoree, Dr. Brownsyne Tucker Edmonds. Also, we want to make sure that we are able to capture all of our attendees today. So if you would, please take a few moments to click the check-in button or check-in link in the chat. This way we're able to make sure that we're capturing all 125 registrants for today's session. We look forward for you to enjoy our session to not only honor the legacy of Dr. Patricia Treadwell, but also to learn about the career and wonderful work of today's honoree, Dr. Brownsyne Tucker Edmonds. So at this time, it is my honor and pleasure to hand off to Dr. Danielle Henderson, Assistant Dean for Diversity Affairs here at the IU School of Medicine. Good afternoon, Dr. Henderson.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Happy to be here. My name is Dr. Danielle Henderson, and I serve as an Assistant Dean for Faculty Affairs, Professional Development, and Diversity. I also have an appointment as an Assistant Professor of Clinical Psychiatry here at Indiana University School of Medicine. It is an honor and a pleasure to welcome you to the 6th Annual Dr. Patricia Treadwell Women in Medicine Lecture. Honoring the legacy of Dr. Patricia Treadwell's 40 years of service to the IU School of Medicine community, this lecture explores how the intersections of race and gender affect academic medicine and the health sciences professions. This annual lecture series marks the transition from Black History Month to Women's History Month. And now I'd like to transition into the land acknowledgement. As we are doing this recording from Indianapolis, Indiana, we would like to acknowledge our location on the traditional and ancestral territory of the Miami, Potawatomi, and Shawnee people. We honor the heritage of Native peoples, what they teach us about the stewardship of the earth, and their continuing efforts today to protect the planet. Our campus stands on the historic homelands of Native peoples and more recently, that of a vibrant Black community also displaced. As the present stewards of the land, we honor them all as we live, work, and study on this campus. And so at this time, I would like to introduce Dr. Patricia Treadwell, who will share a few words and introduce the 2022 Treadwell Woman in Medicine Speaker. So Dr. Treadwell is board certified in pediatrics and dermatology and a fellow of the AAP. She is a graduate of Cornell University School of Medicine and completed residencies in pediatrics and dermatology at the Indiana University Medical Center. In 1983, she became an assistant professor of pediatrics and dermatology at Indiana University School of Medicine and is now a professor emeritus of pediatrics and dermatology. Dr. Treadwell has been involved with issues of healthcare disparities for much of her medical career. She has been a practicing pediatrician at Forest Manor Community Health Center in a medically underserved area in Indianapolis, 1/2 day a week for the past 28 years. Dr. Treadwell is the NCE program chair for the dermatology section of the AAP, past member of the AAP Committee on CME, a past member of the AAP Pediatric Leadership Alliance Planning Group, and past chairperson of the AAP Dermatology section. In July 2015, Dr. Treadwell received the Alvin H. Jacobs Award from the AAP section on dermatology in recognition of her outstanding contribution to the field of pediatric dermatology. She also received the Breakthrough Woman Award presented by the Coalition of 100 Black Women in July 2016. Dr. Patricia Treadwell currently serves as a special advisor to the Dean and Chief Diversity Officer, spanning all of the IU School of Medicine's mission areas. In this role, Dr. Treadwell partners with all of the executive associate deans, as well as the Office of Diversity Affairs, as they develop plans to promote diversity and inclusiveness. In addition to serving as IU School of Medicine's special advisor to the Dean and Chief Diversity Officer. To say that Dr. Treadwell has left a mark on the Indiana University School of Medicine would be an understatement. Through her service as a physician, faculty member, leader, and community change agent, Dr. Treadwell's work and legacy has positively impacted the lives of patients and healthcare providers nationwide. We were truly lucky that she came back to her hometown to share her gifts and talents. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Patricia Treadwell, who will introduce today's keynote speaker.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Danielle, for those kind words. I will go ahead and introduce Dr. Tucker Edmonds. I just spoke with her that her biography has quite a few accomplishments. And if I read them all to you, we would not be able to have a chance to hear her speak. So I'll read some. So Dr. Brownsyne Tucker Edmonds is the inaugural Vice President and Chief Health Equity Officer for Indiana University Health and the Associate Dean for Health Equity Research for Indiana University School of Medicine, where she holds an endowed chair for health equity research. She is an associate professor in the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology. Originally from Atlanta, Georgia, Dr. Tucker Edmonds received her undergraduate degree in community health and African American studies at Brown University. She went on to receive her medical degree from Brown Medical School and concurrently completed a master's in public health at the Harvard School of Public Health with a concentration in quantitative methods. Dr. Tucker Edmonds trained in OBGYN at Duke University Medical Center, where she served as administrative chief resident in her final year. She then entered the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Clinical Scholars Program Fellowship at the University of Pennsylvania, where she received health services research training and a master's in health policy research. She went on to join the faculty of Indiana University School of Medicine, where she completed a clinical ethics fellowship through the IU Health Fairbanks Center for Medical Ethics. Dr. Tucker Edmonds' research interests are health equity and reproductive justice, patient and provider communication, shared decision-making in reproductive healthcare. She aims to understand the impact of racism, classism, and culture on patient preferences and risk perceptions, physician decision-making and counseling, and ultimately variations in treatment provision and service delivery. She is a nationally and internationally recognized expert in communication and decision-making in the management of peri-viable deliveries. In the realm of institutional service, Dr. Tucker Edmonds previously served as the vice chair for faculty development and diversity for IU's Department of OBGYN and a co-director for the workforce development for the Indiana CTSI, and as an assistant dean for diversity affairs in the IU School of Medicine. Dr. Tucker Edmonds is married to Joseph Tucker Edmonds, an associate professor of religious studies and Africana studies at IUPUI. The couple resides in Indianapolis, Indiana with their daughter, Zora, who is 11 years old and the delight of their lives. I present to you the 2022 Woman in Medicine speaker, Dr. Brownsyne Tucker Edmonds.
Thank you so much, Dr. Treadwell. That still felt entirely too long. I'm going to share my slides here. Okay, are you all able to see the screen correctly if Dr. Treadwell could? Perfect. Excellent. Okay, so again, thank you. Thank you for the kind introduction, if not perhaps a bit lengthy. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for the invitation. It's really an honor to be selected as a Treadwell lecturer. Just to even to know and have a relationship with Dr. Treadwell herself, and to appreciate sort of the legacy and the example that she leaves for those of us who are kind of following in her footsteps is tremendous. And so I thank you for the opportunity to share with you all today. I'm going to be talking about a topic that I've sort of dubbed as medical misogynoir. By the time you finish the lecture, you'll have a better handle on what misogynoir is, and that's a new concept for you. But I'm going to talk about its implications in 3 areas: in the realm of maternity care, in the realm of sort of the workplace, and finally in the realm of mental health, particularly for Black women. I should state one quick disclaimer. I am going to be talking predominantly utilizing the frame and the language of Black women. Or Black woman. And I just want to make sure that is that I'm stating up front that that's not with the intention in any way to kind of further marginalize or sort of not acknowledge non-binary and or transgendered individuals who, in my mind, there's room enough at the table. The designation of this language has to do really with the intersection of where we're sitting with Black History Month and Women's History Month, as well as really this particular term and the way that it was coined to speak to the experience of Black women specifically. So that will be the language that I'll be utilizing. And I hope that, there, like I said, there can be room enough for all of us at this table. In terms of where to begin, we're going to first talk about misogynoir in this context of Black maternal mortality. And our nation's maternal mortality crisis has become widely publicized. The US at this point is one of the most dangerous industrialized nations to give birth in, particularly for Black women who experience 3 to 4 times the rate of maternal mortality compared to white women. Their risk of dying in or after pregnancy at this point rivals that of low income or developing nations, of women in low income and developing nations. And so to understand Black maternal health inequities, the latest science on weathering has really helped us to develop a framework for how structural and systemic inequity experienced and embodied as chronic stress accumulate over the life course and even across generations, and then create physiologic disruptions that increase the allostatic load, accelerate cellular aging, and increase disease risk among Black women. And all of this results sort of contributes to inequitable health outcomes. But this is a complicated slide, and I certainly was not prepared with a relatively brief talk to kind of unpack the entire aspect of complexity that really undergirds the problem of Black maternal mortality. And so I decided, which is my tendency actually, that I would look back in order to help us look forward. And so I started kind of here with deciding to focus at the beginning, thinking about the current and historical dominant cultural systems, ideologies, and resource allocations that inform present day biases and obstetric racism. So my mind immediately went to Serena Williams, who, if you all recall, in 2017, following the birth of her daughter, had suffered a postpartum pulmonary embolism. And in a Vogue interview, where she was describing being dismissed as confused, even when she told her healthcare providers exactly what her diagnosis was, exactly the diagnostic testing and treatment that she needed. And a number of folks sort of were dumbfounded in different commentaries and in various conversations, really genuinely perplexed as to how the most famous tennis player in the world could be dismissed, diminished, disbelieved in this fashion. There's sort of this question that was resounding: if fame and fortune can't protect you, then what can? And so to understand why fame and fortune won't save you is to understand how distinctively bias operates against Black women. It's to understand why college-educated Black women die at higher rates from pregnancy-related causes than white women who don't finish high school. In order to understand these odd realities, you really have to understand misogynoir. Misogynoir is a term that was coined by a Black feminist scholar, Moya Bailey, to describe a specifically anti-Black racist form of misogyny that Black women experience as stereotypes, violence, oppression, and dehumanization that are unique to Black women's bodies, experiences, lives, and histories. Serena Williams, from the time that she sort of stepped onto the public scene, has been victim to this particular form of violence. You'll note in these sort of depictions here, immediately notice these portrayals, right, as the angry Black women, the hyper-masculine, manly renderings, or conversely, the hypersexual sort of catsuit depictions. This particular form of violence and dehumanization of Black women has its roots, like most forms of anti-Black racism, in our nation's history of slavery. In 1662, Virginia adopted the legal doctrine of partus sequitur ventrem, which stipulated that the status of the child born to an enslaved woman would follow that of the mother. And that then made enslavement an inheritable status. So once Black children were legally born into slavery, then Black childbearing becomes central to the economic enterprise of slavery. Society then comes to monetize, commodify, and exploit Black women's labor on three fronts: their physical labor, their reproductive labor, and their emotional labor. So if you look back at sort of how white racist ideology has operated, it has to square itself with deeply held virtues of reason, enlightenment, morality. And so narratives are created as justifications for exploitation. And those narratives then become archetypes that essentialize Black women as existing for the functions that they serve in support of whiteness. So Mammy is submissive. The Mammy archetype, she exists for emotional labor. She puts aside her own needs in service of whites' caretaking needs and their domestic servitude. In the contemporary portrayal, she would serve as more like the Black best friend, which if you start to look through media, you'll see as a staple figure, who's really a two-dimensional character that solely exists to provide moral support, typically to sort of the white main character. In regards to sort of the next architect, Jezebel is sexy, right? And she exists for reproductive labor. She meets the sexual and economic interests of white men of that time, justifying sexual victimization of enslaved Black women. She's cast as a seductress, hypersexual, born to breed. And so if you look at her contemporary renderings, they give rise to these notions or tropes around welfare queens. And finally, there's Sapphire, who's sassy or abrasive. She exists in this physical labor realm because she's hyper-masculine, emasculating, and aggressive. She would become sort of the outspoken, kind of belligerent, angry Black woman whose aggression emasculates Black men and threatens white folks. So once you start to look for these patterns of hypermasculinization and hypersexualization, you'll find examples everywhere, from manly Michelle to emasculating Megan. And obstetric racism is in fact rooted in these sort of two-dimensional depictions and reductive ideologies that deny Black women the full range of experience of human emotion, suffering, and pain. That J. Marion Sims, who's pictured here, experimented on enslaved Black bodies to become the father of modern gynecology, reminds and sobers me, frankly, that my own profession's origin stories arise from the dehumanization of Black women. And so the cost of this, which I've termed sort of a form of medical misogynoir, is a system of care that Sergeson et al. Identified as both neglectful and judgmental. This plays out, as one scholar has described, as cumulative deprioritization. There are judgments that are made about Black pregnant people's fitness to parent, which can result in disparate social work consultations and child protective service referrals, the validity of their pain complaints, which then result in inadequate pain management in and after delivery, and also judgments made about their respectability based on age, marital status, appearance, resulting in demeaning behaviors and insensitive comments that have been documented about sort of their babies' daddies or their children's Black sounding names. These were the study findings. Altman and their colleagues reported that women of color also expressed that power dynamics, interpersonal racism, and judgmental attitudes influenced how healthcare providers chose to share information with them. And in turn, these experiences had a meaningful impact on their ability to even engage in and control decision-making. And so with these dynamics at play, sort of this backdrop, I study shared decision-making as a model that may mitigate maternal health inequities by humanizing, elevating, and centering Black pregnant people. When I speak of shared decision-making, I speak in terms of shared power. Anybody out there who knows me knows how much I love acronyms. So when I'm talking about shared power, that means that the clinical encounter is structured around first shared priorities, that we create a shared agenda by inviting patients to tell us their must discuss items and to ensure that their concerns are addressed and centered, that we manage expectations about the desired and most probable outcomes depending on their expressed goals of care, that we attend to patients' wants, eliciting their preferences and values to align them with our treatment plan, that we acknowledge patients' expertise in their lived experience and engage in bidirectional exchange of information and expertise. And finally, that we take on shared responsibility, partnering to make decisions together. Notably, shared decision-making only attends to the interpersonal aspects of implicit bias and obstetric racism. These efforts will have to be paired with systemic and structural changes for meaningful change to occur. To develop a patient-centered model of care, we'll need to integrate new frameworks into the manner in which we deliver reproductive health care across the life course. These will include frameworks like trauma-informed care, which is sort of organized around these principles of safety and trustworthy transparency, peer support, collaboration, empowerment. As well as frameworks such as reproductive justice, which was developed by Black women to advocate for their human right to maintain bodily autonomy, to have children or not have children, and to parent those children in safe and sustainable communities. And within the realm of obstetrics, we are going to need to integrate medical and midwifery models of care to ensure that Black women are afforded the full spectrum of supports that are needed. The midwifery model offers a woman-centered model that we as medical providers can learn from. In 2019, I had the honor of serving on a consensus study committee that produced the National Academy of Medicine's report on birth settings in America. And we spent a lot of time really wrestling with this sort of tension related to, how do we attend to this dual reality that woman-centered midwifery models may mitigate some aspects of harm to Black women. At the same time, we have these effects of systemic racism and weathering, which have physiologic consequences that are rendering Black women more vulnerable to medical and obstetrical morbidity. And in those cases, it may be that they are more safely managed with medical teams in hospital-based settings. And so while current debates are actually still very active and very much focused on whether Black women would fare better birthing in the hospital or out of hospital, it's my hope that we will move away from these either or strategies and discussions to really forge a more integrative model of care, because I fully believe that Black women are deserving of both and. I'll close this section of the talk with just a quote by the Combahee River Collective, which was a Black feminist movement that was named after a Union Army raid that Harriet Tubman led in 1863 to liberate 750 enslaved people in South Carolina. And they state that if Black women were free, it would mean that everyone else would have to be free, since our freedom would necessitate the destruction of all the systems of oppression. So if you think that misogynoir and these sort of two-dimensional dehumanizing archetypes are only operating in the space of patient care, then you're sadly mistaken. And there's actually a robust body of literature that I discovered in preparing for this talk that really point also to its harmful impact in the workforce and in the workplace. Dickens and Chavez actually had conducted a really nice study that looked at, it's qualitative study that looked at the costs and benefits of shifting identities at work among early career US Black women. They talked about identity shifting as altering kind of cultural behaviors and languages to de-emphasize a negatively valued identity, sort of speaking back to some of those archetypes and stereotypes, in an effort to increase white people's comfort around Black people. And they talk about the ways that Black women have to maintain a level of stigma consciousness, meaning it's a double consciousness of being aware at all times of who you are, but also how you're perceived. And I won't be able to clearly, with the time that we have and with the small print, be able to point to all of these pieces here. But one thing that I'll kind of call out is this, among the themes that emerged, they talked about how they manage interpersonal rejection, this frozen effect, which says, I check out of the conversation because of that experience of discrimination. Then I get questioned if I'm engaged or if I'm passionate about being here. The entire piece, the piece is worth looking at because it really, there's so many quotes in here that really capture the ways that sort of conforming and comporting and contouring kind of ourselves to fit the norm, kind of what the perceived benefits are, but certainly also what the costs are that are experienced. But I'll just highlight two because they brought some of the archetypes out into play, particularly that of the angry Black woman. So confronting and dismantling stereotypes was one of the themes that emerged in their interviews of study participants. And Brittany states that, sometimes I want to do whatever, but because of how I am looked at as an African-American woman, I can say something like, I don't like the way you said that. And somebody can be like, oh my, she's being hostile. But I guess I was supposed to say it like in a soft, nice voice. Oh, I don't like the way you said that. And then they would be like, oh, she's not being hostile. They also talked about this model citizen moment of, so I think that if I can do my best to be a model Black citizen, then hopefully somebody who has a negative perception of Black people or Black women, that we are loud and uneducated, then maybe if they meet me, then the next woman they meet, they won't be like that. And so it speaks both reminding me of this sort of sapphire image that people are kind of trying to create this distance from based on what they understand to be perceptions of how these tropes kind of follow them or precede them into the workplace, but also the burden of representation that comes before you even do any of your work that you are actually required to do, that you have to kind of represent in this way. And so it's really interesting because, and this is a TED Talk that I would just encourage everyone who's listening to immediately do not pass go, go and listen to. It says it's a talk by Jodi Ann Burry that's called Why You Should Not Bring Your Authentic Self to Work. And she talks about how being authentic and this notion, which we hear on every turn, and I will come back to give the disclaimer that I am not advocating for inauthenticity. I am advocating for caution and for understanding of the cultures that we've really created and what we have to shift for everyone to be able to be authentic in their participation. But what she says is that being authentic privileges those already a part of the dominant culture. She says that the call to brave work with more authenticity undeservedly disadvantages people of color, those of us who are already burdened with the task of chronically battling bias. If who we are makes us as difficult as they say, then this demand for our authenticity compromises our careers. She gives sort of the example that when you sort of start off, there's a bit of a sort of bait and switch kind of moment of, we start off with everyone saying we're looking for passionate people who can bring a fresh perspective to challenge our way of thinking. But then as the challenges emerge and the discomfort sets in, then you get the shift to, she gives the example, people telling her, you need to work on being more of a team player. Your approach makes it difficult to work with you. Try to help others feel more comfortable around you. You're hurting your relationships at work when you talk about racism. So she goes on to then describe this pet or threat workplace phenomenon, which had initially been described by Keisha Thomas of the University of Georgia in 2013. And she noted in her study that women of color, when they started to exhibit competence and became more vocal and confident in their performance, that there was sort of a shift in attitude, ranging from indifferent to hostile. emerging from colleagues who at once sort of ostensibly lauded or supported them. And this is when I heard and learned about this work by Dr. Thomas, I immediately brought to mind sort of this schema that I had come across some years ago, talking about sort of the problem woman of color in the workplace, whereby, women would come in, feeling welcomed and needed and happy, and then starting to try, as they said, to bring in those, fresh perspectives and to sort of point to maybe problems, pushing for accountability. And then that the response could be that either denial, ignoring, blaming, or actually putting the responsibility back on the woman of color to fix the problems that were identified. And in the worst cases, and quite frequently, actually, that then at some point, the shift, this is back to that pet to threat moment of where then actually the organization decides that the woman of color is the problem, not the problems that have been identified, but the woman of color. And then, it can be sort of framed in terms of a conflict around communication or personal issues, claims that they're just not a good fit, and then they end up exiting out of the organization. And this sort of cycle is one that is so well documented and mapped really to this notion of what Dr. Thomas was describing in this pet to threat phenomenon. On an interpersonal level, I felt like all of that kind of compacted into this other model that she provides called DARVO, which is not an acronym that I would create because I don't know what DARVO means, but deny, where, you kind of try to point to racial bias or call for accountability. And then it's, this has nothing to do with your race. You're being too sensitive or too angry. And then this notion that after deny, attack, that you reverse the victim with the offender, which is kind of that like final stage in that schema where, if you're going to play the race card every time I try to give you feedback, it's going to make it really hard for us to work together. I just want you to be successful here. I'm just trying to protect you. So again, sort of that reversal in this moment when you're, trying to kind of live out what you ostensibly thought you were called to do in that moment of being authentic. And so what Dr. Burry, she's not a PhD, I don't believe, but what Jodi Ann Burry concluded was that, coming just as we are when we're the first, the only, the different, or one of a few can prove too risky. We can wear the cost, and so we wear the costume. And she starts off her talk talking about a costume party that she was told, you don't have to dress up. People are just going to come as, come in whatever you like. And then she gets there, and of course, everyone's in costume and they're playing a contest. Of course, she's not getting any points, right? So she says, so we wear the costume. We straighten our curly hair for interviews. We restate our directives as optional suggestions. We talk about the weather instead of police brutality. We mourn Breonna Taylor alone. We ignore the racist comments our supervisor makes. We stop correcting our mispronounced names. We ask fewer questions. We learn to say nothing and smile. And then we're told we have imposter syndrome. And so this is sort of actually the piece that brought me to their work. This is in the Harvard Business Review last year, 2021. It's in the top 100 downloaded articles, and another one that I highly recommend to start to sort of really grapple in this space. This is Tulshan and Burry wrote, "Stop telling women they have imposter syndrome." And so imposter syndrome, I'm sure most of you are familiar with this notion of doubting your abilities or feeling like a fraud, which I saw with new eyes when I put it in context with this notion that like there's the call for authenticity, but then it's not necessarily safe to be authentic. And so this notion of already sort of presenting kind of only a part of yourself may actually undergird some of what's happening at the operating institutionally, right? And they say that imposter syndrome, as it's been traditionally described, disproportionately affects high-achieving people who find it difficult to accept their accomplishments, and is especially prevalent in biased, toxic cultures that value individualism and overwork. So I don't know if that sounds like anybody that's out there or anywhere that anyone's ever worked, but that was definitely got my attention in this space. But they note, and this is sort of the important sort of pivot moment in their analysis, that the impact of systemic racism, classism, xenophobia, and other biases was categorically absent when the concept of imposter syndrome was developed. They say that imposter syndrome puts the blame on individuals without accounting for historical and cultural contexts that are foundational to how it manifests both in women and in women of color and in white women, actually. And so their real critique, the crux of their argument is that imposter syndrome directs our view toward fixing women at work instead of fixing the places where women work. Murray states that, many of us across the world are implicitly, if not explicitly, told we don't belong in white and male-dominated workspaces. In truth, we don't belong because we were never supposed to belong. You've heard people talk about, the system isn't broken, the system is working exactly as it was created to function. And so she talks about these biased practices across institutions that continue to stymie the ability of individuals from underrepresented groups to truly thrive. And what they identify then is that the notion and that the mantra for us as organizations and institutions that want to cultivate cultures that are safe for folks to be their full authentic selves is that we have to start fixing the places, not the women. That the answer to overcoming imposter syndrome is not to fix individuals, but to create an environment that fosters a variety of leadership styles and in which diverse racial, ethnic, and gender identities are seen as just as professional as the current model. They talk about strategies to end imposter syndrome in your workplace. We are not going to be able to delve deeply into each of these, but they talk specifically about pivoting the language that we use, being honest about the impact of bias, reducing bias against women of color in particular, being data-driven and rigorous, quit gaslighting and listen, sponsor and mentor women of color, and set up accountability mechanisms for change. I'm going to pull out a couple of these just to drill down on in terms of some of their specific recommendations. They talk about being honest about the impact of bias, and I wanted to highlight this one because they talk about the Eurocentric model of professionalism as a cage for everyone, most tightly constraining Black women. I actually would encourage every single person that's listening to go back and look at your evaluation forms for our job interview processes. If your department, unit, division, et cetera, has a question about whether they were professional, I would bring that to someone's attention to sort of start to have a conversation about, because the notions and the expectations of what represents professionalism have been very limiting historically. And so they say that the onus is on leaders, us as leaders with employees from underrepresented backgrounds, to spend time understanding that the frameworks determining these professionalism standards are already rigged against women, especially women of color, and will likely reinforce self-doubt and unbelonging. They talk about being data-driven and rigorous, specifically thinking about processes that can create barriers, and rather than sort of assuming that that they're just should be written off as an individual aspect of imposter syndrome. They talk about getting points of feedback, anonymous surveys. They talk about assessing your organization's performance criteria, specifically looking at the average time to promotion. And we know about that sort of leaky pipeline with regards to women and people of color being left behind in terms of promotion and tenure. So those are opportunities and actually work that I believe is to be underway. They talk about sponsoring and mentoring women of color. And I like this quote because it says, most men don't walk into the workplace on day one and say, here I am, I deserve to be CEO, I've got everything it takes. We've all met someone who does, but most folks don't, right? They come in and then they're getting reinforcement from senior people who see themselves reflected in them, right? We reproduce ourselves in these spaces. And so we've completely failed to account for the role that all of this constant reinforcement and encouragement has in making men seemingly more confident or self-promoting. And I should also state that the imposter phenomenon is actually universal in terms of all genders and race. It's actually very widely held phenomenon, but the places where it's typified and where you typically see the banner waved are in the spaces around sort of women and people of color. So that I just wanted to speak to that with regards to not overselling the point about confidence and self-promotion among men. But they give us this sort of ABCDs of sponsorship and mentorship, talking about that in order to kind of respond to this and to actually try to cultivate this sense of confidence and self-promotion among all of our workforce, that we're going to need to amplify, boost, connect, and defend women of color with intention. in the interest of time, I am not going to go through these individually because I do want to kind of wrap up with regards to sort of this next segment. But there are some really important opportunities in that article in terms of how we can set up accountability mechanisms within our organizations to try to ensure that we're really facilitating and fostering inclusivity and psychologically safe work environments. And so this actually resonated with the Combahee the Combahee collective quote, and it's one that came out of this article. It says, how Black women experience your organizational culture may serve as a litmus test for the inclusion levels at your company. Instead of seeing the experience of the most underserved, or I'd say like maybe marginalized, as outliers to the data, centering them to drive the next steps for organizational change. The final sort of touch points and talking points I want to kind of bring you through is, as I stated, that these stereotypic kind of two-dimensional depictions and reductive ideologies, I stated earlier that they deny Black women the full range and experience of human emotion, suffering, and pain. And so really the last set of comments I want to make are really to and for Black women in the audience and in academia, thinking specifically about what toll this has on our mental health. And there's actually work again in researching some of this that's been done with regards to how internalizing these types of stereotypic notions, in particular the mammy and sapphire archetypes, actually is associated with lower self-esteem in Black women. They talk about this sort of internalization with women maybe ending up identifying or defining themselves only in terms of relationships to others, and sort of basing their happiness on other people's well-being and satisfaction because of this sense that they're supposed to be in service. That's their function, right? Is to be in service of others. That has sort of negative associations or impacts on self-esteem. Likewise with that sapphire stereotype and this sort of notion and worry about being perceived as overly aggressive, that then you can actually really struggle to express feelings of anger, disappointment, hurt, and that women who are may then try to overcompensate, suppressing those feelings, but then can lose their tempers or feel out of control, and that too sort of undergirds this sense of guilt and lowered self-esteem. So it was also interesting that those authors actually had hypothesized that the strong Black woman kind of archetype or trope was going to be positively associated with self-esteem. That it, in fact, though not in their sort of final kind of analyses with other factors controlled, but that it in fact was also negatively associated with self-esteem. And there's sort of the point that was made in the papers that the strong Black woman is a mantra for so much a part of the US culture that it is seldom realized the great toll it takes on the emotional well-being of African-American women, that as much as it may give her sort of the illusion of control, it actually keeps her from identifying what she needs and reaching out for help. In 2021, we watched a number of Black superwomen contend with their humanity on the national stage. And we had to bear witness to the violent and vehement backlash that accompanied their falls from grace. We saw how no matter how many titles or medals or matches they served up, as soon as they failed to perform their function, they were discounted and discarded. But I was heartened by Simone Biles and Naomi Osaka, who chose to honor their minds and bodies, who chose to recognize and respect their limits. And so to Black women listening to this talk today, I want to close with just a reminder to you and me both that you are not a machine, that we should stop grinding. That doesn't mean that we stop pursuing excellence. It means that we stop pursuing it at the expense of ourselves, that you simply must learn to rest and to recover. This is just, I just wanted to sort of underscore this point of like healing yourself. And I had to give a shout out to Girl Trick, which people who know me know I'm a bit of an evangelist for at this point, in terms of recognizing that caring for ourselves is not self-indulgent, that it is self-preservation, that it is active political warfare, that it is revolutionary in spaces where we are not intended to thrive. That quote by Audre Lorde and this work that is really focusing on building sisterhood, building communities, building families, and walking toward our healthiest selves, there's sort of a call to return to our health. There's a call to rediscover ourselves. I shared this little, meme or something. I don't even know where it came from. I shared it with my peer mentor thread, a group of about 6 Black women I trained with at Duke. And it was incredibly difficult for us to figure out how to define ourselves, who we are, without it being in reference to something that we do, someone that we are related to, someone who is in need of us. So I landed at being a lover of justice, ice cream, laughter, sunshine, and R&B, but I don't know where you'll land. And then knowing your source and really being and remaining connected to that which really girds you and provides you with strength, meaning, purpose, and hope. For me, that would be my faith, for sure. My friends and my family. So I'll just move past that so that I don't spend too long sitting with it because it is emotional. My mom is actually, I don't know if she opened the link, I sent it to her, but she's here for her birthday, which is tomorrow. And I am here because George and Stella, my parents, decided that they would, that they would, even in the face of being escorted on and off of their campuses by police in that moment of sort of integrating campuses, that there was something greater for them and for us in the future. And that, I guess that also speaks to our forefathers, which I will say that I landed here in part because we're closing out Black History Month, and it's a moment for reflection and for honoring sort of the contributions of Black folks throughout history, that Black history is American history. And in the face of all of the craze that's going on with CRT and those kinds of considerations, I will say I actually get it. I understand why there's so much resistance, because to know our history is to marvel at our resilience and our resourcefulness and our power, frankly. To realize this kind of out of 1619, that the author talks about the fact that that none of us in this audience, in this moment, will live to see the time when Black folks in our nation have been free for more time than they were enslaved, is tremendous. The progress that we've made in the face of, in spite of, is tremendous. And so I was at church Sunday, we were singing the Black National Anthem, closing out Black History Month. And I was really reflecting on this. We have come over a way that with tears have been watered. We have come treading our path through the blood of the slaughtered. And so the marvel of it is that you are here, that this is, again, sort of my closing comments to Black women in this audience. The marvel of it all is that you are here, that you are worthy. And I hope that you know that you are enough. If my husband sent me a text to say that you are perfect just the way you are. If there's nobody in your corner that can remind you of that, because that is not what we hear most of our days and most of our time, then I encourage you to really start to reach out to back to those families and friends to have that undergird. If anything, the real fear may not be that we aren't enough, but rather that we are entirely too much. And I don't know how many of you have read this piece, but it says that our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. It is our light, not our darkness, that most frightens us. And I'll finish to say that, your playing small does not serve the world. And I say that in juxtaposition to the risk that I know that is out there sometimes for being your full, bright, incredible light self. And yet, that's why we have each other. The only last thing I will say to that, when I was thinking about it, we're thinking about friends and families. I also want to underscore the fact, because and this is not as a signal or to, this is because I was thinking about the people who have allowed for me to be here. And I've had tremendous allies in my life and in my career. And so I think if you are feeling alone, I think I want you to know that you are not. And I want you to know that there are, that it is possible to build kind of relationship and connection in this space. I'll end here just with that you are the wonder. I marvel at your greatness. And I'll close just with from the lift every voice and sing, God of our weary years, God of our silent tears, thou who hast brought us thus far on the way, thou who hast by thy might led us into the light, keep us forever in the path, we pray.
You know, every time I get to hear Dr. Tucker Edmonds present, I always say I'm not going to cry, but you always find a way to move me through emotion. So thank you so much for this wonderful and timely presentation. It's an amazing talk, but also, honestly, the love letter that we needed as we bridge Black History Month and Women's History Month. So again, I say thank you to that. And I definitely am seeing it through private messages as well as questions that are coming in. So let me acknowledge the emotion and the reality that I'm experiencing right now. But I do want to guide us into your first question. So again, just I cannot say that how timely and necessary this particular presentation is, how timely your message is, and just to say thank you. So pull it together. All right. So I think one question that is becoming salient, and I've received this question in different iterations through private messages. So for the sake of presenters and just to have anonymity, the question really revolves around how do we support Black women and women of color in having to navigate professionalism, stereotypes, and white womanhood. So like, how do we create safe spaces for women of color in light of the weaponization of white womanhood is in academic medicine or other spaces?
That's a big question. I will tell you strategies. I have no universal answers or silver bullets. It is a real reality. It's one that's well documented. There's not here to create, to forge people against each other, but that reality is well documented and widely experienced. And I will say for myself that I mentioned my peer mentorship kind of networks. It has been so critical to have safe spaces that are predominantly women of color, to sort of gird and support and to check, because there's a lot of gaslighting that goes on. There's a lot of turning things around on you. So having a checkpoint. And I will also say that there is learning to be done across those spaces. If and where you find safe, trustworthy, I was going to say about it, and then I realized where I was. Allies, white women, are good. There is good across the spectrum, right? So when you can find those relationships, they actually can help you to gain greater kind of insight into kind of what dynamics are sometimes missed across these spaces. And so I too have found allies in spaces that were unexpected and been able to learn and grow in those relationships. But I will say that I have had to be intentional about cultivating safe circles, largely women of color that I can call on when I'm navigating a space that feels thorny and uncertain.
Thank you so much for that. And this is we have probably time for one more question because we're at 12:54.
I'm sorry.
No. This is definitely not something where any apologies are needed, but I think more so, you've spoken quite eloquently to how the work that is necessary is not one where we are placing blame or fault on victims, that we have to utilize metric-based accountability to help move our institutions forward. I also see that we have a number of leaders at the departmental level. We have chairs, we have executive associate deans that are joining us today. We have a number of community leaders also present here. If you could maybe speak to what are 3 components that we need to think about at systems levels, whether it's utilizing different currencies to promote institutional development and or succession planning. We think about the legacies of our institution in this context of misogynoir in health and mental wellness, as well as in workplace safety.
Yeah, I mean, well, you just gave me one, so thank you for the cheat sheet. I do think that and there are real opportunities with regard to succession planning. And what I will say about that, I mean, that was partially why I was sort of speaking to that issue about professionalism and who we deem professional. I also kind of hear it, there's sometimes language where people feel like, you know, we don't have, that we don't, when we are looking out to think about developing our leadership, oftentimes we're looking for people who have the designated titles or experience, as opposed to understanding how the work, which is oftentimes being done by people of color, by women in the background, right? And then not being assigned the titles and afforded the acknowledgement that those folks have the ability to lead, but they've not had the formal assignation as such. And so I think that there are opportunities for us to think more broadly about what criteria we are utilizing to identify those with leadership potential. But in the meantime, we can be much more intentional about identifying people of color, women, people who bring diverse perspectives to the table, and bringing them under our wings and thinking about those sponsorship efforts. So yeah, I think you mentioned succession planning. That's a great opportunity. I think that, and as I said, I think we have a lot of work to do even as we continue to look at our recruitment, you know, kind of our talent acquisition kinds of approaches and things that there's work that can be done. And then of course, you know, I'm in the space as a health equity officer now where there's a lot of emphasis on data. And, you know, I'm always saying data is necessary, but not sufficient, right? But it is important that we start to benchmark ourselves, that we understand where we are starting, that we use it as a mechanism to have greater transparency and accountability for what we're doing in terms of making progress. And that's from the spaces of representation in our leadership and our divisions and departments, all the way to those questions about who's advancing and who's not and why. Because the point of data is to point you to where there's opportunity, where should we be asking more questions, where should we be putting resources and intention in terms of identifying where disparity emerges. So I think that those are, if we're gonna say 3, I know we're at 12:58. I will stop there, but I hope that that's helpful.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Tucker Edmonds. I would like to hand it over to the namesake of this wonderful event. Before I do our official closeout, Dr. Treadwell, or actually, Dr. Tucker Edmonds, do you have one more thing or a question?
Shimon Neal is right in the middle of my screen, and she is the first person who sent me the Dare to Lead with Brene, and the rest is history. So I have to thank Shimon. And then I thought I saw Matt Ellen in the room. I can't give enough shout outs. I see Rich Frank. I see so many people I have to give shout outs to. But when I talk about allies and I talk about people who have sponsored me, so many of you are in this room. And I am so grateful to so many people here who have shown me support and friendship through the years. So thank y'all.
Absolutely. Absolutely. No problem at all. Dr. Treadwell, before I do the official closeout for today's lecture, is there anything that you would like to share with our audience, or a word to Dr. Tucker Edmonds?
I'm going to steal her husband's "You are perfect." And thank you so much. I'm very proud to have had you as the speaker.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I cannot echo those sentiments enough. To say that it's an honor and a pleasure to not only help facilitate this particular event to honor the legacy of Dr. Patricia Treadwell in her over 40 years of service and her small R retirement efforts would be an understatement. Thank you so much for all that you have done and continue to do for our campus community and for the field of medicine overall. The work that you do has led the way and built pathways for so many, including our wonderful honoree today, Dr. Brownsyne Tucker Edmonds. Thank you so much for your words of encouragement, for your critical lens on topics and making them accessible for all members of our community to grasp, to reflect on, and to implement in our day-to-day work. We do see the question coming up about how can people take advantage of this wonderful presentation today. We will have the recording of today's session available in the Faculty Affairs, Professional Development and Diversity, FAPDB, events page on our website online. So please use this as an opportunity to take in today's session if you were not unable to be in attendance today, or if you feel that this is a necessary recording that people within your department should view. We definitely want to encourage people to take insight with it. Also, please make sure that you have checked in for today's session. The link for check-in is available in the chat. We are now at 101, and our goal is to make sure that not only we brought you into this space, but we're also able to send you off into your day to be able to continue to help bring equity and justice-centered best practices to our institution. So on behalf of the IU School of Medicine, Faculty Affairs, Professional Development and Diversity, we'd like to thank you for being in attendance for the 2022 Patricia Treadwell Women in Medicine Lecture. Also, I will be remiss if I did not thank my colleagues that have also worked so hard to make this event possible. Thank you so much to Richard Brown, who is our Assistant Director for Diversity Affairs, and Anyea Taylor, who is our Events Specialist for FAPDB. If you have any questions for today's events, please reach out to us at fapdb@iu.edu. And again, thank you so, so much, Dr. Tucker Edmonds, for an amazing presentation and word that will really, I think, uplift us as we go, not only throughout the month of March, as we have closed out the month of February, but honestly, what will guide us through 2022. Have a wonderful day. Thank you so much for your time, sharing your time and talents with our community. Have a great one.